John, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Oh, sure. So I was a college professor until I recently retired, and I taught Christian history and thought. Along with, I taught at a liberal arts college, so I taught introduction to philosophy, philosophy of religion, world religions, history. So a broad range of topics I enjoyed. Um, I retired to the mountains of North Carolina. I love to kayak and hike and fish, um, and have 5 children, 2 biological and 3 adopted from India. Um, so we have quite an interesting and mixed family. Adopted some children as infants and some as older children. Uh, so quite a varied family.
Cool. I think the topic today was how different theists view God and justice. Could you tell me more about your position on that?
So about a decade ago, I began reading more in the social sciences. That's not my training, but I began reading the social sciences, political scientists, some of my colleagues in political science, sociology, anthropology, and they began giving me materials to try to explain the polarization in America on political and social issues. Um, and as I read this material, uh, I was thinking, like, wait a minute. The models that they're using, cognitive models, not only explain the polarization in America on social and political issues, I thought this explains what's going on in Christianity in America. Why you have such different views of God, different views of the purpose of the Bible, what the Bible is, different views of who Jesus is and what Jesus accomplished, different views of hell. And I started connecting, and I hope to talk more about this, connections between hell and the American criminal justice system, and different views about what's called the unevangelized, that is, those who've never heard about Jesus. If Jesus is the only, in Christianity, there's a problem of evil. Part of the problem of evil is if Jesus is the only Savior, then what about those who've never heard of Jesus? Um, you may have heard of a fellow named Augustine, late 4th, early 5th century uh, writer and pastor, bishop. And one of the leading um, uh, critics of Christianity of his day posed the question, what about those who've never heard of Jesus, if Jesus is the only Savior? And so that's been a question for a long time. And when you think about that issue, I started noticing similarities to um, uh, the issue of wealth inequality in America, and the explanation that certain people give to that to um, to explain that matched the explanation I was seeing from people like Augustine and John Calvin and others on the question of the unevangelized. So what I saw was that this social science research, these 2 cognitive models that I'll explain in just a bit, also seemed to me to explain a huge divide in American Christianity. And let me just say, though I haven't written on this part, um, I also see it in Islam and Judaism and even in India and Hinduism. So I think the 2 cognitive models are very explanatory in religions around the world. So, if you will, let me just explain where the models come from and the basics of what they are. So, they're grounded in they're older than this, but back in 1992, a political scientist came up with 4 questions. These questions now occur in what's called the national election studies that occur every major election in the United States. They do these surveys. And they've been going on for like 50 years. And then there's the World Values Survey. So they use these same questions around the world in different cultures, different languages, etc. And they get remarkably the same results. So if you're listeners, just take a little quiz here, 4-question quiz. Now, these are traits that you prefer in children. Now, both traits are good. It's just which ones do you prefer? Okay, so here they are. Do you prefer independence or respect for elders? Okay, that's your first choice. Independence, respect for elders. Secondly, good manners or curiosity. Third choice, well-behaved or being considerate. And fourth choice, do you prefer children who are self-reliant or obedient? So, independence, respect for elders, good manners, curiosity, well-behaved, being considerate, self-reliant, or obedient. So, if you chose independence, curiosity, being considerate, and self-reliant, you are what social scientists call strongly nurturant. That's the name of the model. Now, not everybody uses the same name, so I've chosen these two, but nurturant. If you chose respect for elders, good manners, well-behaved, and obedience, then you are strongly authoritative. So nurturant and authoritative are the 2 names that I'm using. There are multiple names for these models, which I can go into if you want. Now, in America, it turns out that 16% of Americans select all 4 authoritative traits. 26% choose 3 of the 4 authoritative traits. 13% choose all 4 nurturant traits, and 19% choose 3 of the nurturant traits. And then the remaining 26% of Americans choose 2 authoritative and 2 nurturant. So these are the 2 models overall, or I should say, that's not the models. This is what some political scientists call their Rosetta Stone. This is their key to unlocking what people are going to say, all these correlations about what kind of beer you like to drink, what kind of coffee you like to drink, what kind of TV shows, books you read. They've got it down to even the food you buy at the grocery store. So it's anywhere from you like Coors Light or you like craft beers. You like TV shows and movies with intricate plots, nuanced characters. They're not completely good, they're not completely bad. Versus, no, you like characters like all good, all bad, it's cut and dried. And you like TV shows where there's a clear winner. So authoritative are on one side, nurturants on the other. And of course, there's mixed. Remember, there's always that mixed category. So there's people all over the place. And let me just summarize the core values of the 2. So nurturants prioritize empathy, cooperation, perspective taking, and they're comfortable with complexity. Authoritatives prefer obedience to rules, maintaining social order, individual responsibility, and cognitive closure. That is, there's an absolute right and wrong. They've got it figured out. When it comes to justice, nurturants think of justice as the goods and services of society should be distributed such that everyone has the potential to flourish in life. And authoritatives tend to define justice as you get what you deserve. So, with those in mind, social science psychologists, sociologists, political scientists apply them on a broad range of issues. And what I did was I thought, man, I think this explains what's going on in Christianity in America and actually throughout history. It's not just America, but I focus on uh, American Christianity. So there's the two models and the questions that lead to kind of the demarcation of the models. And there's more. There's much more, of course, that I could explain. But I'll stop there and see, if you have any responses or questions.
There was a one question Digital Gnosis asked: do you have the data on how many psychopaths would choose the authoritative versus how many specific Christian branches like Calvinists would choose one or the other? It's like, do they have specific data on those kind of things?
Yeah. So no, I don't have data on that question. But what I do is show that Augustine, John Calvin, Calvinists are strongly authoritative. I mean, you just read their writings; they're strongly authoritative. And then you have people like Teresa of Avila, Julian of Norwich, um, uh, and let's see, I'm trying to think. Well, our contemporary um, Christian writer Brian McLaren, popular writer, he's strongly nurturing. So you have these two throughout history. So what I do in my book is just give examples, historical examples of people who lined up on these different sides. And it comes out in issues such as the slavery debate in the Civil War, how you read the Bible, um, and it's by the way, these two views are in the Bible itself. So it's not that the Bible is singularly one or the other. Um, I think that a case can be made that overall the Bible prefers a nurturant deity, but uh, and I base that particularly on the gospel accounts of the teachings of Jesus, but there are strongly authoritative accounts of God. And I address some of those in the book as well. I mean, there's genocidal texts, for instance, in the Bible, where God says all Canaanites are to be destroyed, wiped out. Um, and there
And
are
the
strongly,
world flood thing, that was a big
yes,
one.
yes, yeah. Um, so I think these two views are very ancient. I don't think they're new. It's just social scientists are using them to study humans today.
There was a question in the audience of if you think the Bible would fall on more nurturing or more authoritative.
Yeah. So okay. So I don't think it's a clear-cut answer. I think it's difficult and challenging to answer that question. Though my answer, and again, I have epistemic humility. I know that there are very smart people who disagree with me. Okay. Um, I base it on Jesus. And so I have a chapter on Jesus and his use of the Bible that existed in Jesus uh, wrote, which is largely what we today call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And Jesus was very selective in which texts he would use. Um, in fact, Jesus even stops mid sentence at one point. He's in a synagogue in Nazareth and he's proclaiming his mission. And he's quoting from the book of Isaiah. And he says, Yahweh, the God of Israel, has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, light to the blind, lift up the downtrodden. And then he stops, doesn't even finish the sentence, and says, and the day of judgment of our God. He's like, no, not that part. When Jesus talks about Gentiles, and Paul does this in his writings in the New Testament as well, very selective about Gentiles, that is, non-Jews. They highlight texts about Gentiles who did wonderful things for the people of Israel. Um, and they don't talk about the texts in the Hebrew Bible that are hostile to Gentiles. In other words, they do what I say this in the book, and I mean this, and it's kind of an irritant to conservative Christians when they hear me say this, but Jesus and Paul cherry pick texts from the Hebrew Bible.
But what about every jot and tittle?
Yes. So Jesus says, he's not come to abolish the law, he says, but to fulfill it. And so there's questions about what that word fulfill means. And I believe that, and so my chapter in my book, Embracing Prodigals, is arguing that Jesus lifts up the nurturing texts about God and what God has in mind for the world, and sets aside the authoritative texts and says the nurturant rabbis have understood God correctly, and the authoritative rabbis misunderstand God. There were nurturant rabbis. It wasn't all. Jesus was not the first nurturant rabbi in Israel. Hillel, who lived a century before Jesus, uh, basically summarizes the entire Torah the same way Jesus does. There was a critic of Judaism who came to Rabbi Hillel and said, I'll convert to Judaism if you can tell me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot. So the guy stood on one foot, and Hillel said, okay, what you don't want someone to do to you, don't do to them. Jesus put it, so it's called, the negative version of the way of love. Jesus just put it positively. What you want others to do to you, do to them. Called the Golden Rule. So Hillel had it, and of course Confucius has a statement very similar to it, and many others. It's not original to Jews or Jesus,
I believe it
but
came from Hinduism originally.
now that could be. I don't remember ever reading anything in the
Yeah, they have like
Gita.
a almost exact copy, I
Oh,
think.
the Bhagavad Gita has a statement in it. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Sorry, I've only been haven't been teaching for 2 years, and already I'm forgetting things. So, yeah.
So Digital Gnosis asks, could it be that our psychology is nurturant due to sin and God is authoritative?
So say that again.
Could it be that our psychology is nurturant due to sin and God is authoritative?
Um, okay, so let me make sure I'm trying to understand the question here. So God is authoritative, but Sanders and other Christians and religious people and social scientists, you don't have to be religious, right? I mean, you can be an atheist and be a nurturer, and atheist be an authoritative. Um, but if God is authoritative, is it sin that's leading us to a nurturant understanding of God? Okay, yeah, that's possible. So I once told one of my professors in seminary that perhaps my views were so warped because God had determined that I would sin in this way. So, and there are theologians who have said that my view of God. So I'm one of the leading developers of a view of God called the openness of God, divine openness, which simply means two things basically. God is open and affected by what creatures do. And secondly, the future is open; it's not closed. So there's no determinate future. It's a multi possible future. So I'm one of the leading exponents of that view. And a Calvinist theologian has said that uh, basically God is using me to wake up the church in America to this disastrous view, and it's going to destroy the church if we don't get busy. So he thinks that God determines everything, including what I say and write. So God orchestrated that I would develop this view that he thinks. So I'm trying to answer your person's question here. So here you have an authoritative God who is determining that Sanders develop a nurturant view of God. For some reason, God only knows. And I'll be punished in hell forever and tortured in hell for it. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that there are a number of rabbis who are authoritative and a number who are nurturant. And do you think that you interpret it as being the nurturant ones are correct? Could you be wrong about that? Could it be the
Oh,
case that
absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. Of course I could be wrong.
And how would you tell one way or the other?
Okay, so I build what's called a cumulative case. It's not like one one thing settles the matter. But in terms of epistemology, I don't think that there is one uh, way of reasoning fits all. So I reject some of the Enlightenment thinkers' claims about that. Um, um, so how would I say that? Well, okay, so part of it is I'm going to speak as a Christian. Okay, so I'm just going to start there. Now you say, but wait a minute, you can't start there. There's people in the audience who aren't religious. Like, I get that. Okay, and so I could back up, but where do I back up to? Like it's like asking which places in Ohio are starting places. Well, wherever you are is a starting place.
I would say
So,
not Ohio is a good starting place.
well, I prefer the mountains of North Carolina, but I grew up in the farm fields and corn, soybean fields of Illinois. Um, okay, so uh, so to be honest, I'm not going to answer your question, Tom. How do I know? Okay, I don't know for sure. All right, I have um, a wide array of reasons that are not going to be persuasive to everyone. Depends on the audience I'm talking to and the person I'm talking to as to which reasons I might give. Um, but what I want to go back to is the question, for instance, of the authoritative God and its you know sin or malfeasance that leads me to in the wrong direction. So could I be heading in the wrong direction because I'm so corrupted? Yeah. So one theologian put it this way. He's a fellow I actually taught with for a year and knew personally, but he wrote this in one of his articles criticizing my work. And he said Sanders came up with this warped view of God because he didn't properly handle his brother's death. So when I was in high school, one of my brothers died in a motorcycle accident. And that led me to a period of questioning and blaming God and searching, which is interesting because I was raised United Methodist. Why was I blaming God? Because that's really not Methodist theology. But this theology that all things happen for a reason is quite pervasive in America. If somebody is in a car crash or develops cancer, oh, God has a reason for it. And so this person believed that and said that the reason Sanders develops this weird theology is because he was affected by his brother's death and he couldn't properly cope with it. So now you can psychologize me. In other words, yeah, you can psychoanalyze me and say my views are warped because of, these things happened in my life.
I've always found that a strange argument because I think that the reason everyone believes is because there's something they don't understand, and so they
Yeah.
construct an idea to try to comprehend what they don't comprehend. And just
Yes.
the fact
Yeah.
that one's an emotional thing they don't understand doesn't make any difference if it's a logical thing they don't understand.
Right.
I don't see why it's
Yes.
a
Yeah.
good
That's a good
argument.
point. Yeah, it's a good point, and it can be flipped right back onto them. You can make the same accusation against them. It doesn't get you anywhere, in my opinion. But it's a common claim by Calvinist evangelicals in the United States. It's a common. So they usually use two things. One is I'm so warped by my past, or I've wholly succumbed, as really famous theologian put it, evangelical theologian put it in the 1990s. And he said Sanders and Clark Pinnock want to be liked by their non-Christian colleagues. In other words, the atheists that I teach with, I want to be liked by them. So I come up with these, distorted views of God and things. So they've hurled these accusations instead of actually dealing with, like biblical texts and the philosophical arguments that we put forth for the positions. Which, of course, you deal a lot with philosophy, so you know that everything in philosophy is question. I mean, there's just like hardly anything that you can't say that can't be questioned. But of course, questions, and scholars put forth ideas, and they're going to be questioned.
So my
Let
initial
me go ahead.
thoughts on your opening is that it seems like the same kind of research that's done in the difference between conservatism and liberalism, and that the moral progress that we've experienced over time, which leans us less authoritative or more authoritative in the past, or more authoritative in struggling times, more authoritative in strife-ridden times, all that seems to be a very common trait in psychology due to human evolution. And what is it that makes you inspired and to look at this as a method to understand different religious contexts or religious beliefs as opposed to uh, an evolutionary tendency?
Yeah. So I find the explanatory value incredibly helpful. And again, what I'm talking about are correlations, not causation. So, uh, so in terms of evolutionary psychology, so that's I've read a little bit in that field of cognitive science, and there are people who are debating this and why we think the way we do, etc. So I also have a book called Theology in the Flesh: How Human Embodiment and Culture Shapes the Way We Think About Truth, Morality, and God. So there I get into more of the cognitive science issues, and particularly a field called cognitive linguistics. And that's how human embodiment shapes the way we think. So if we say, for instance, that God sees all of time at once, okay, well, why do you say God sees? I mean, well, because humans see. Um, the Shema in Judaism is a text of the Bible, but it's a prayer that many Jews say every day. Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. That's Hebrew for "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone, Yahweh only." Um, so hear. Why do you say "Hear, O Israel"? Well, because human beings have hearing. So it's based on the sensory motor system of the human body and how we can interact with our environment. So the claim that I make in that book, based on cognitive linguistics, is that all of our thoughts, even about God, are based on the human sensory motor system. Well, that is, what we can perceive, what we can experience, what we can comprehend. And so, of course, we're going to say God sees, and we're going to lay time out in a timeline. Of course, you can think of time as cyclical, but cyclical or a timeline is still, these are human ways of knowing. And so whether we think of God as authoritative or nurturant, we're still thinking of God in human constructions. We never escape that. Okay. So I'm fine with all that. Now, let's see. Oh yeah, the evolutionary psychology. I'm not as familiar with that, so I haven't done as much reading in that field as you probably have. Um, I just know that there are cognitive scientists who are debating the meaning of evolutionary psychology, and I'm not opposed to it. Please, I'm not. I just I'm not as versed in it. I'm just telling you the things I am more versed in, and why I came to some of these views. Um, so let me circle back because I want to talk about a couple of things that maybe your audience might find interesting. So when it comes to views of God and the authoritative and nurturant views of God and what that leads to. So an authoritative God is demanding and strict in one's obedience. So um, some views of the authoritative God have God micromanaging all of creation. John Calvin had that view. God determines the very words I'm saying right now. Before creation, God had ordained that I would hold the views I have and speak the words right now. Nurturants tend to say, no, 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 God isn't controlling like that. That's not a loving way to be controlling others. Um, God gives hospitality. God shows welcome, embrace, and God has high expectations. Yeah. So there is a view called permissive. In that view, God just says, "Oh, whatever you do is fine." It has no expectations for it. The authoritative God has high expectations, but very little emotional warmth. God does not accept you until you follow the rules. Nurturance, God accepts you, welcomes you, and says, "I want to help you live a flourishing life." Wants to uh, empower you to live uh, a better life, a life that's not as harmful to others and to yourself. Now, the authoritative God is driven by obedience and wants um, us to adore God and to worship God, etc. Um, and if you don't, then this God says, "I will torture you forever." And so views of hell were developed. And so there's a paradigm view of hell. And this is what's called eternal conscious punishment. That hell is eternal, is forever, and it's conscious. You're aware, and it's punishment. God is punishing you forever in hell. So that's kind of the paradigm. When people think of hell, that's what's typically thought of. That view did not originate in the New Testament, and it's really doesn't get going until many centuries later. Um, and it was promoted by Augustine, but it was rejected by the Eastern Orthodox Church in many respects. And I'll explain why in just a minute. But so the authoritative God says, you think of Dante's book Inferno, and he's entering the Inferno hell, and the sign above the door says, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." There's no hope. So in America, we say, "You haven't got a preacher's chance in hell of achieving your goal," meaning you haven't got any chance of going to hell and persuading people to leave. So in America, we tend to say of people have done really harmful crimes, we say, "Lock them up and throw away the key." Well, that's exactly what God does in this version of hell. God locks them up, throws away the key. There is no attempt at rehabilitation. There is no attempt at restoration of the community. It's just they must be punished. So the authoritative God is about retributive justice, not about restorative justice. But there have always been other views of hell, and many people don't realize this. So if you want to read some about this, I'll self-promote my website here. So you can go to dr, that is drjohnsanders.com, drjohnsanders.com. And part of my website has things about hell and the unevangelized. And one of the articles is, "Must Christians believe in hell?" And I say, well, it depends on what you mean by hell. There's always been multiple views in Christianity. So one of the views is called annihilationism, that those who refuse to accept God's grace just cease to exist. There's no suffering, there's no torment, they just cease to exist. Another view is that after death, people in hell, God seeks to restore them. And the idea is that Jesus actually went to hell on Saturday. Jesus crucified on Friday, died Friday. And on Saturday, Jesus goes to hell and breaks the gates of hell down and releases captives. And so this is very popular in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And among many Protestants today, it's made a comeback. And then another view of hell is God finally restores everyone from hell. It's called universal salvation. Everyone will be redeemed. No one is left behind. And that view we know is very old. It goes back at least to the 3rd century with Gregory of Nyssa, who is a patron saint of the Eastern Orthodox Church. He argued for it. in the 3rd century, a fellow named Origen first argued. Well, we think first. I'm not sure if he's first, but he argued for it as well. So there are views that think that hell is restorative, and there are views that think hell is solely retributive. One thing you can ask is, are the gates of hell locked from the inside or the outside? Now, of course, many of your audience don't believe in hell. I get that. That's fine. I'm just talking about what Christians, Muslims, Jews believe about this. So is hell locked from the inside or outside? Well, of course, the authoritative view is God locks it from the outside, so they can't escape. But C.S. Lewis, a prominent Christian writer of the 20th century, said, no. He wrote a whole book called The Great Divorce. And in that book, these people they're in the outskirts of hell, and they take a bus trip to the outskirts of heaven. It's a very imaginative book. And you have the opportunity to leave hell, will you? And for Lewis, no. They lock the gates from the inside. They refuse to allow others to help them. And they go within themselves and basically destroy themselves from the inside. So these different views of hell, and they match up to authoritative and nurturant views of God and the core values that authoritatives and nurturants have. So that's where I see the explanatory power. So I'm trying to answer one of your questions is why do I go this way? So I think these two models explain the motivation, why someone would find eternal conscious punishment. I mean, the greatest New Testament scholar of our time is Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, a British thinker. He says the idea of eternal conscious punishment is like a concentration camp. It makes God into a Nazi. This is horrible. But how could it make sense? I'm saying, well, it makes sense if you have authoritative values. Now, it's not to say that every authoritative, social scientists don't say that every authoritative will believe, for instance, in the death penalty. But the vast majority of them do and find it making sense. Nurturants find the death penalty very problematic. So I'm just mapping these two views onto these Christian teachings and saying that it makes sense. The models explain why people would be motivated. And so another issue is for authoritatives, they tend to have there's only one correct view on every issue, one correct view, and they argue they have it. The problem is Christians have always debated, even on baptism and the Lord's Supper, there are multiple views. There's not a single view. So nurturants are more open to holding like several views that they find okay, legitimate. Authoritatives, no, one view. And so for authoritatives, it's eternal conscious punishment. And if you disagree with it, they say you're destroying God's hell. Like, okay. So that's just one example of how I'm applying these models. Why it makes sense that nurturant values lead to different views on these same doctrinal issues as authoritative values lead to other views.
I mean, I would agree. I would say that people have innate personality biases, and they use those personality biases to interpret different works and identify with the things that fit their values. And I'd say that's true of everything pretty much. And so I think that if we look at some of the most common psychological personality traits, which is authoritative ruling systems versus nurturing ruling systems, we get the biggest political divides in human nature.
Yeah.
And so I definitely understand the context. And it seems to mirror a lot of the work in evolutionary psychology and sociology and just how human personalities differ in general. And there seems to be a pattern in how that changes over time, like moral progress, how it tends to be moving more towards nurturing over time.
Yeah, I'm not so sure right now, but I was more optimistic a few years ago. Um,
Well, I think the trends are usually on larger timescales, like
yeah, yes,
women's
yes,
rights,
yeah,
LGBT rights, veganism. Like it's not going to happen. It's not like an overnight thing.
yeah, yeah. So I'm hopeful, and we have seen progress. I mean, if you go back to, I mean, just take the issue of slavery in the United States. Um, let me give you um, a couple of quotes here. Um, so prior to the Civil War, a Baptist minister in Virginia quoted this passage of the book of Exodus. Okay, it's Exodus 21 verses 20 through 22. When a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod, so you have a staff and you hit your male or female slave, and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. Doesn't say what the punishment will be, says the owner will be punished. But if the slave survives a day, then there will be no punishment because the slave is the owner's property. So the idea is that you belong to that person. You're owned by that person. That person can beat you. If they hit you and kill you, then they're punished in some way. But if they hit you and you don't die immediately, well, then they didn't intend to kill you. So there won't be any punishment to the owner. So a Baptist minister in Virginia cited that passage and then said this, quote, "The Bible is the divine authority given by God, and it grants slave owners the right to own slaves and the right to beat slaves with a rod that results in the death of the slave." Now, today we find this abhorrent. We're like, who in their right mind would think this way? But really, it's not so long ago. And we fought, the United States had an entire civil war over this issue. Today, the issues are different. So it's what to do with LGBTQ people. And you find authoritative saying, but the Bible's clear. The Bible clearly says these people are sinners and God is angry at them and they must be punished. And nurturants are like, I'm not sure the biblical texts are really talking about same-sex marriage. So there's arguments that the biblical texts about same-sex relations are about power and raping other people, and that sort of thing, rather than same-sex loving relationships. But in the 1800s, in the United States, people were using these texts in a way to say, this is the way of right. Slavery is justified, and God is for slavery. And you had other Christians, nurturant Christians, who were arguing, no, take this text in the Bible. And they had to be, okay, the problem was, and Mark Knoll, his historian, has a wonderful book on this. The biblical texts that are used at the time of the Civil War. The authoritatives had the easiest job because all they had to do was quote like Exodus 21. There you go, buddy. Proof text, bingo, the Bible says it. Nurturants had to resort to sophisticated ways of interpreting the Bible and ways of saying, yeah, that text says that, but you know what? We don't morally agree with that text anymore. We think that text is immoral. And we're going to revise or even set aside that biblical text. And authoritative say, you can't set aside any biblical text. It's all or nothing, buddy. You can't cherry pick from the Bible. One of the things I do in a chapter in my book, Embracing Prodigals, is show that Christians have always had, throughout history, at least 6 ways of going through the biblical text and saying, yeah, no, I don't think our community is going to follow that passage anymore. Okay, like a woman who is not engaged has, if she's raped, then she has to marry the person, or the person that raped her has to marry her. Okay, in Deuteronomy it says that. At least since the 5th century, Christians have said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And there's other texts of the Bible, such as There's a passage in the book of Joshua that says the sun stood still so that Israel could win the battle over their enemies that day. And even in Martin Luther's day, remember the debate about Copernicus and Galileo was taking place? And Martin Luther said, look, God knows best how the universe operates. And the Bible says the sun stood still. It didn't say the earth slowed in its rotation on its axis. Okay? So Galileo and Copernicus are wrong. Now, I disagree with John Calvin on most everything, but on this one, I think he got it right. John Calvin said, maybe we should let the scientists do astronomy and not interpret the Bible as teaching us proper astronomy. And he said it was the way of humans. You know, it looks like the sun stood still, but of course the sun isn't moving. It's the earth that's moving. So it's a human way of speaking. And so you have people now who say, oh, yeah, that verse in the Bible, or the earth stands on its foundations. It will never be moved. That was also a text that was used by both Catholics and Protestants against Galileo. And, you know, there were different interpretations of that. So what I'm saying is nurturants find ways principled ways, 6 principled ways of revising and even setting aside biblical teaching, either because it's not scientific, it's not moral, we find it objectionable, and it's not like individuals, it's communities of religious people who do this. But authorities say that's illegitimate, but they don't do it. They don't actually practice it. I mean, did they beat their children with rods? They say, we follow the Bible about childhood disciplining our children. Well, no, you don't, actually. And you know what? We think that's a good thing. And if they did practice it, well, they go to prison for it. So, again, nurturants and authorities are going to look at the Bible very differently, interpret it differently. They see God differently. So let me bring up one other view that perhaps some of your... Oh, go ahead.
One I was thinking of was flat earthers. I've spoken to a number of flat earthers, and they have a similar kind of interpretation, a very literal interpretation of the Bible when it says it stands on 4 pillars. It has a firmament. The stars are trapped in the sky, those kinds of things. And so this pattern of when you say nurturants reinterpreting statements of the Bible, I see that the vast majority of people reinterpret statements of the Bible to fit their preconceived interpretations. And it seems like there's many more than just 2, the authoritatives and the nurturants. Those are just probably the 2 most common psychological traits. And that there is always... It seems like it's something everybody does for the most part, is that they have psychological coping mechanisms to make distant information fit your preconceived ideas, especially if it's emotionally important to you. So if you have a holy book and you're psychologically different than other people, you're going to interpret the statements of the holy book differently than the other groups. But I don't see this as fundamentally very different from any of the other work in sociology. Why would the Bible or religious interpretations here be an outlier compared to just anything people interpret from their own personal biases? What is the significance of this particular subject versus any other?
So are you asking, do we apply these 2 cognitive models, authoritative, nurturant, and by the way, those are the 2 main ones that they're studying, but there's also the permissive and the distant views. There's actually a quadrant of 4. But the 2 most popular and common are authoritative and nurturant. So if you're asking, well, we study these in other areas of life, such as should the federal government do more to address income inequality? Okay, that's not a religious topic. I mean, so don't people just have their own views about that? Well, yes. So I don't think I'm disagreeing with you on that. Maybe I don't think so. Um, so why bother to study religion? Well, um, I find religion a fascinating topic, um, and so I want to engage it, and I'm trying to understand. So for me, the key is the values. It's the values of authoritativs and the different values that, and particularly their definitions of justice. These lead to so radically different views of how we should live, how states should be governed, what the federal government should do. And they lead to very different views of what they think God is doing, and ultimate reality, or the future is like. And they think that it leads to different views of sin, different views of salvation. Um, so that's what I'm interested. I'm just interested in using these social science models to help explain, to help understand. And for instance, so my book may not be of interest to your audience very much, okay? But if they do talk to religious people, it may help them better understand, oh, this person's an authoritative Christian. So they're more likely to think X, Y, and Z and to value A and B. Okay. Versus if they're talking to someone who's a nurturant religious person. So it could be of value to them. I, I'm not saying that they should become Christians or anything, but to understand as they talk to people. I think it's helpful there.
I mean, yeah, I definitely can see using generalizations of people's psychological tendencies to understand their interpretations. It makes sense. But I'm still not like understanding what is the, because I tend to think of it in more general, larger scale, like moral progress statements that as society moves forward, we get
Okay.
more nurturance.
Right.
And
Okay.
what is the, why do we make these generalizations? What is the
Yeah.
benefit of these generalizations?
Okay. So one of the purposes of my book is to argue that, so I'm arguing specifically to a Christian community, and I'm seeking to persuade them that the nurturing values and nurturing way of life is a better way of life. So the social science research shows that states that are more have more nurturing values have better education systems, better health systems. Um, People are better off. Uh, so in terms of research, they call them tight versus loose states. Research on that. In terms of mental health, I could quote a paragraph or two of the book, citing that nurturants have less anxiety, depression, mental health issues, less substance abuse um, than authoritatives do. Um, so I think in terms of mental health of people, the way they live, the way they relate to each other, I think the research overwhelmingly, now again, it's social science research. That's not like 100% positive, but it's overwhelmingly supportive of nurturant values. It leads to better human life. So I'm trying to persuade Christians that the nurturant way of life is superior on two basic sets of reasons. One, the social science research, and secondly, if you're a Christian, then it ought to matter to you that Jesus was a nurturant. Unfortunately, authoritative Christians tend to really not pay that much attention to Jesus, other than, oh, Jesus died to pay the penalty that we owed God. Okay, and so it's called the atonement is important, but Jesus' lifestyle and Jesus's teachings are really not that important to authoritative.
Yeah, I remember
So
there's
I'm
those memes online of Jesus as a brown social communist, everything against the Christians, the more right leaning Christians' values.
yeah, white nationalism, yeah, white national Christians. Yeah, one meme I just thought of is there's an image in the book of Revelation of Jesus standing at the door and knocking on a house. And so there's a famous painting of Jesus standing at somebody's door and knocking on their house. And the person inside says, "Who's there?" And Jesus says, "It's Jesus." The person inside says, "Well, what do you want?" Jesus says, "I want you to let me in." The person says, "Why?" And Jesus says, "Because you need to let me in. You're in trouble." "Why am I in trouble?" "Because if you don't let me in, what am I going to do to you?" Okay, so Jesus is this cosmic figure who's, you know, I put it this way: Jesus is serving time in heaven. So on the cross, Jesus said, "God, forgive these people." He forgives his killers. But when Jesus gets done serving time in heaven, Jesus is coming back as this menacing figure who's going to gun down, all his everybody who's opposed to Jesus. And like, wow, Jesus is going to be a changed man from the guy that said, "Forgive them." So I'm trying to persuade Christians that the nurturant values are superior, and people can change. People do change from one to the other. It's the research doesn't show that if you're raised nurturant, you will end up nurturant. You may well, but you can change. And there was a young woman who was raised in the Westboro Baptist Church. I don't know if you've ever heard of them.
Yeah,
It's
a little bit.
it's a tiny kind. It's like 40 people. Um, but they get national headlines because they say God hates fags, and they protest at American soldier funerals and things like that. They say God hates the United States because it's affirming of LGBTQ people, same-sex marriage, etc. Um, and a woman who was raised from a child in that Westboro Baptist church believed that everybody online was going to attack her, which is pretty common. I mean, online conversations are generally vicious. Um, and most people just attacked her, and it just reinforced what she was told. But one Jewish person just asked her, "So why do you believe this? What motivates you to think this way?" And was rather gentle with her. It took a couple of years, but she finally left the congregation. And in doing so, that meant that her parents would never speak to her again. So she now devotes herself to a more nurturing view of God, nurturing view towards Christianity. So it takes a lot to bring strong authoritative out of this, but it can be done. You're going to have more success talking to people who are mixed and persuading them that nurturant values are superior way of life. So it can be done. So that's why I'm doing it. It's not just to explain. I think the models are helpful to understand. So at least you can understand, oh, that's why they think I'm immoral. So, I mean, actually, start one of the chapters of the book with somebody saying, "Wait a minute, Sanders, do you have any moral values?" I'm like, "What do you mean? Do I have any moral values?" But because to them, I wasn't giving the authoritative code words for morality. So for them, "Oh, you don't have any values." I'm like, "No, I have moral standards. I have values, but I don't have authoritative ones." And so for authoritative, if you don't have my values, well, you don't have values.
I'm an atheist. I get that a lot from
Yes,
Christians.
yes. Yeah, you can't possibly have values. Like, what? No, that's just erroneous. So, two things. One, trying to help nurturants understand authoritatives better. And then, secondly, understand how to approach them with Christian teachings to, I hope, persuade them. And so, in your case, bend the moral arc of the universe more towards the nurturant side. Yes, I am definitely trying to do that. So, I say that authoritative religion, and I have a hard time calling it authoritative Christianity because I don't think it's Christian. So I actually in the book I say it is a false gospel, and it is actually it's erroneous, it's harmful, and it needs to go. So I'm very
Why do you say
strong about that.
it's false in that case? Because the way I think about it, I'd say most of the very early Christians and the Jews directly prior to Christianity probably had a very authoritative interpretation of the Old Testament and Jesus, or what they expected the Messiah to be like. Jesus brings the sword, right? So why would you say that's the false one?
So, so I'm going to disagree with you that most Jews at the time were authoritative. Um, Now, I don't know the exact percentages, but I don't. Um, I mean, when you read the rabbis, there are different. There's authoritative rabbis and nurturant rabbis prior to Jesus. And in terms of the New Testament interpretation of Jesus, you do have some authoritative texts in the New Testament. I acknowledge that. But I think the overwhelming message is nurturing. And one of the examples I give is this. What do you do with Gentiles who want to follow the Jewish Jesus? Because all the original followers of Jesus are Jewish. It's a very tiny community, just a few hundred people, but they're all Jewish, and they have been steeped in their synagogue teaching. They went to synagogue school, so they know, and they've heard that Gentiles are excluded from God's kingdom. They're not allowed in. But these Gentiles are experiencing, the New Testament talks about they're experiencing the Holy Spirit. So do you let them in or not? This was a huge debate that took place in the years 49 and 50 of the Common Era. And it's in the New Testament, Acts chapter 15. Most of Paul's letters, Romans and Galatians, are written about this issue, whether Gentiles can follow the Jewish Jesus without converting to Judaism. It's a huge issue. And one could appeal to biblical texts that say, no, no, no. Unless Gentiles convert to Judaism, they can't follow the Jewish Messiah. But the early Jesus community in the year 50 had a meeting in Jerusalem. And they decided, the leadership decided, that Gentiles, non-Jews, could become followers of Jesus, and they didn't have to keep male circumcision. Secondly, they did not have to keep the dietary regulations, so they can eat pork, they can eat lobster. And third, they don't have to practice the temple regulations. This is staggering. I mean, if you think of what demarcates Judaism at the time of the Roman Empire, it's really those things. And so this early Jesus community that's all Jewish decides that these Gentiles don't have to become Jewish. I think that's a very nurturant move, nurturant way of interpreting the Hebrew Bible. So were there authoritative Christians? Yes. Did some in that audience in the year 50, in that council, disagree? Well, Acts 15, somewhere around verse 6 says, there was great dissension. Okay. So were there people who disagreed? Yes. And were there people who didn't agree? They said, well, you guys have gone off the deep end. We're separating. Yes. The first split in Christianity that we know of occurred then. And you had Christians in the community of Antioch in Syria today that, or Lebanon, who said that Paul is wrong and Peter's wrong, and they went a different way. So do you have authoritative Christians there? Yes. Do you have nurturant Christians there? Yes. And these two sides have been competing against each other from the very beginning.
Well, I like to think about it from the modern data. The modern data shows that the most inclusive, accepting people are usually like atheists, secularists, and
Yeah.
like of the progressive Christians is a very small minority. And the question I usually like to ask them is, why is it that the vast majority of Christians seem to disagree with progressive Christianity, and the people who do agree are atheists and people who don't believe in God? And so there seems to be a trend that the people who are the most nurturant are not believing in a God being who determines all of the right and wrong in the universe. It seems to be an association to simply having the idea of a God and authoritativeness in general.
So Tom, are you asking why do progressive Christians agree more with atheists, or
Sort of. It's more
on
like,
these issues?
to me, there's a dissonance between the idea that if the nurtured interpretation of Christianity was correct, then you would expect the vast majority of Christians to be more nurturant. And if the authoritative interpretation of Christianity was correct, you would expect there to be a trend towards authoritativeness.
Mhm.
And so, from my perspective, I would think that the authoritative interpretation of Christianity was probably correct, because I tend to think that in the past people were more authoritative.
Yeah.
And the nurtured interpretation, I think, is more moral. I think they are right that it is a better system. I agree with you, it's a better system, but I don't think it's a more Christian system. I think it's a less Christian system. I think as we move
Okay.
forward in time and become more nurturant, I think we leave more of Christianity behind and adopt a more centralized view of morality that is independent of Christianity. That's something
Mhm.
more tied into the fundamental essence of whatever morality is.
Yeah.
And so it's hard for me to think that the nurturance interpretation of Christianity is correct. That seems like a stretch.
Okay.
Seems like a harder thing to accept.
Yeah. Yeah. So thanks. That helps me understand where you're coming from. So yeah, I get that. I understand that. If one says simply, what is the preponderance, for instance, of um, let's just pick somebody's different. So the interpretation of Plato on, for instance, the forms, Plato's forms. Well, you have different scholars who disagree on the interpretation of Plato's forms. Do you simply go with the majority and say, well, that's the true interpretation of Plato's forms? Um, well, I, I, I don't do that. So even if the majority of Christians are authoritative, and by the way, I'm not sure that's correct, that the majority are authoritative, but they are more organized and they get their message out better. They have think tanks to support their position. Um, and part of it is because authoritatives want to control everything. So they develop what I call kudzu religion. Kudzu is a plant in the southeastern United States that is a vine that was imported here, and it grows over everything and chokes everything else out. So authoritative religion wants to be a monopoly, and they destroy everything else. So you can understand why they could become the most common form, because they get rid of. I mean, they cut the tongues out. Christians cut the tongues out of other Christians. They burned them at the stake. They threw them in rivers with chains to rebaptize them. Um, so in Philadelphia, uh, in the early 1800s, um, there were Protestant Christians who killed Catholic priests and some nuns in Philadelphia. What was the debate? It was over which translation of the Bible would be used in Philadelphia's public schools. Okay, so are there authoritative and authoritative Christians, and do they tend to dominate the airwaves and the publishing houses, etc.? Yes, because they are really well organized, and they tend to set the public agenda. But I'm not
Well,
sure there's actually.
do you think that's it? Because I think that the fact of having an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being who determines the absolute truth of everything and who is pure justice seems to be a feature of authoritative thinking that is very attractive to them. And
Yes,
it
yes,
seems like the nurturant thinking, that's the whole idea of this one God being who does all these things, would be very dissonant with the idea of being nurturant in the first place.
right,
And so it seems to me to make sense that there's a natural human tendency for the nurturant people to not be Christian, whereas there's a natural human tendency for authoritative people to be Christian, or specifically monotheist.
yeah,
And if we assume Christianity was true, then the way the Bible was written would, if it was nurturant, would likely try to tend to favor the nurturant individuals more than the authoritative individuals, but that seems to be the opposite of what we're seeing.
Yeah. So what I argue is that, so I use what's called a Christocentric interpretation of Scripture. So Jesus becomes the model of what Christianity should be like. Not every Christian uses that. So if Jesus is nurturant, then nurturant is the true model of Christianity. Now, that can be debated. So I said yes. Can I be wrong? Yes, I can be wrong. But that's what I argue, and I've argued in other books, that nurturant Christianity is the genuine form of Christianity. But authoritativs are very clever at interpreting. They are excellent at distorting the Christian message. So they've done an excellent job.
Well, can they do better than God? Because I mean, imagine if it's written by God.
Well, okay. So for those authoritativs who are what we call theological determinists, that means God determines everything that happens. Okay, not all authoritativs are determinists, but Calvinists tend to be there. There are some Catholics who tend to be, but not all authoritative Catholics. I'd say probably the majority of authoritative Catholics are not determinists. They try and follow Thomas Aquinas, and there's debate whether Aquinas is actually a determinist or not. But yes, if God is a determinist, well, then things are exactly the way they should be, that God wants them to be. In other words, every cancer, every murder, everything that's happening, every person offers a cup of water to somebody who's thirsty, is exactly what God wants to happen at that time. Nurturants just disagree with that. God is not. So I've argued, so the openness of God is not a determinist. What God decides to do is in part influenced by what creatures do. So that's a more nurturing line of thought. Now, by the way, there are nurturants who think of God as a force that is not an agent. So God is just like the goodness, of the universe or something like that, but not a being with self-consciousness. So there are nurturants who don't believe in what we call God being an agent. Non-agential is technical term for them.
What versions are those? Because I usually thought of God as entailing consciousness as one of the main requirements.
Oh, yeah. So one of the books I hope to write in the future is actually a course I taught for over 30 years. It's called Concepts of God. So I go back to ancient Greeks and others and develop through history the different views of God. So by far and away the most common or paradigmatic view of God is that God is an agent with self-consciousness. But then you have views from Aristotle where...
just to clarify, are there versions of Christianity that think God wasn't conscious? Because I'm definitely familiar with pantheism.
Okay. All right. So thank you. All right. So are there... yes, there are people who say, yes, I'm a follower of Jesus. I believe that God is a force. God is not an agent. So there are people who espouse such ideas. Now, it's a small minority. Okay, so maybe you've never heard of them, but...
Do they have a name that I can Google and research?
They have a name. No, but in the book America's Four Gods, and their sociologists and their most recent research shows that what's called the distant view, and one of the versions of the distant view is this view of God as non-agent. This is the fastest growing view of the divine in the United States right now, in the past decade. And I think part of it is, people are saying, well, if Christianity is this white Christian nationalism, and I've got to be a member of a certain political party, and I have to believe this and this and this. Well, then to hell with that. I'm not a Christian. I'm out of here. They're called the nuns. So on surveys, they say, do you have any religious affiliation? And they check the box, none. So that's the fastest growing form of people in the United States, particularly under age 30. Because Christianity has become identified with a particular political party and particular stances on social and political issues. And they're saying, well, if that's Christianity, then I'm not a Christian. I don't blame them. I'm like, yeah. Part of what I'm doing in my book is saying, yes, but maybe you've never heard of nurturant Christianity. If they grew up in an authoritative church, all they ever heard is there's a bunch of heretics who don't believe the truth and are going to be burned in hell forever. Well, yeah, but they've never known about those views. I mean, over the years, students were amazed when I tell them different views that Christians have held back in the 6th century or even the 2nd century. Like there were Christians who only had salt and water to celebrate communion. You go, what? They didn't have wine? They didn't have bread? No, they had salt and water. They had their reasons for it, but okay. So there's lots of different views, but if you've grown up in an authoritative congregation and you went to an authoritative college, an evangelical college, you likely never heard different views. I taught, so your audience knows this, I taught most of my life at evangelical colleges. I was finally asked to leave by the board of trustees of one of those colleges. So I had to find a different school to teach at and finish my career. But one of the reasons that the board of trustees gave that they didn't like the way I taught. It wasn't just the content that I had these weird views of God and things and views of hell and stuff. It's the way I taught. That is, Christian views of the Lord's Supper. Oh, here are 4 views that Christians have held. Christian views of hell. Here are 5 views that Christians have held. Here's the biblical text they use to support each of the views. Here's the theological arguments they use to support those views. And I usually didn't say which view I thought was correct. My job was to inform them of the different views, the reasons people held those different views, and then allow them to make up their own minds. So authorities don't like, so one pastor in a church we went to, I was teaching Sunday school this way, and he said, I don't want you teaching Sunday school anymore. I said, really? Why not? He said, because you're not teaching the one true view. And I knew, of course, that was his view. And I said, well, if I taught the true view, it wouldn't be your view. So, okay. Like, because in that class of adults, I'm teaching these views on the topic of what about those who've never heard of Jesus? And I present the views. And then one person, college professor, said, well, who holds that? And I didn't say, our pastor? I never said that. And said, well, John Calvin held that view. Jonathan Edwards held that view. Many prominent Christians have held that view. But other prominent Christians hold these other views. Okay. So they didn't like the way I taught. And one of the reasons is because I'm not teaching the single true view.
Do you think that if we adopted the more nurturing view that more people would stay in Christianity, or do you think they'd leave and become more atheists?
So my hope is they would become more nurturant Christians, but some are becoming atheists. I have friends, former colleagues of mine who have left Christianity because, different reasons. I mean, they're not all the same reasons, but they generally hold to a nurturant way of life, nurturant values. And they just don't find belief in a God, particularly as an agent, plausible anymore. And yeah, I talked with them. I understand that. I get it. I don't. So this might surprise me. I don't think ill of them. To me, it's like quite understandable why one would think that way. I don't find
And
it irrational or ridiculous or anything like that. No, I think it's
my
quite
intuition is
plausible.
that people who are nurturant and the nurturant ideology tend away from a god being or an ultimate authority. And that's why I feel like it's strange for the idea of Christianity to be centered around an authoritative figure, but to be nurturant. That seems a very weird, very strange contradiction to me.
Yeah. Well, so maybe it's the people I hang with, Tom. But um, we've never found it strange. Uh, I've always been writing. I didn't know, I didn't have the social science categories of authoritative and nurturant, but all my books going back to 92, I now realize were based upon nurturant values. I didn't know that at the time because I wasn't, you know, reading the social science research. Um, but there were others too. There were other Christian thinkers who were debating this. But in the world of evangelical Christianity, now there's also a segment of Roman Catholicism that's deeply authoritative and don't like the present Pope at all. Pope Francis is an
When does that ever
antichrist.
happen? When did a group of Christians ever disagree with the Catholic Church? Never heard of that before.
Yeah. Um, but in evangelical Christianity, which has become rather monolithic, quite homogenous, but there's always been evangelicals who were trying to reform evangelicalism, and I spent my life trying to do that. I think I made some progress, some gains, but overall, I don't think I changed. So the word evangelical now to me is simply fundamentalism. I don't see any difference between evangelicals and fundamental. The fundamentalists won the name evangelical, and they're deeply. So I just switched using the terms and find authoritative a better term to use. It's deeply authoritative. They have their own religious education, their own curriculums, their own textbooks, um, and it's very hard to get people out of that. I have had some success. I've had thousands of people write me letters and make phone calls over the years and say, "Thank you, thank you. I can pray again." um, but I'm in this congregation that is deeply authoritative. What do I do? And I say, well, you likely have to find either a group of people there. If you're in a rural area, you may just have to find a group of people who are nurturant, and you need to. If I could, it's like forming a support group, and you need that. Or if you're in a more, urban or area, there are nurturant congregations that you can go to. Um, Uh, but overall, authoritatives have won evangelical Christianity in the United States. Yeah, and I tried for over 30 years to do something, and again, I had limited success. But most of those people that I know of have left evangelical congregations. They don't attend church at evangelicalism. They attend nurturant churches somewhere, or like you say, some of them have left Christianity, religion. They just, yeah.
Well, I feel that as time progresses and we increase our technological and ability to produce resources and have excess resources, people will naturally tend more nurturant. So I think over time, the next few hundred years, we'll see a decline in evangelicalism, or what will be evangelicalism in the future will be not look like it does today. I think the evangelicalism of today is far more moderate than the evangelicalism of the past.
No, no, I quite disagree with that assessment. Evangelicalism in the 19th century was much more diverse uh, than it
So
is
I'm
now.
fundamentalism. The fundamentalism of
Oh,
each
fundamentalism.
generation
Yeah.
tends to become less fundamental.
Hmm. Uh, well, I can see some indicators of that, but yeah, I think it just has to die.
Uh, well, we've been going for about an hour and a half. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find more about your work?
Sure. So you can go to the letter D-R, and then my name, John, John, Sanders, Sanders. So it's drjohnsanders.com is my website, where they can find more information. But I don't have my most recent book, Embracing Prodigals, up on my website. I got to get to that. Uh, uh, but they can find a lot of this information uh, on there, and links to other sites. I'm not the only person saying these things. There are many others. But uh, uh, anyway, so I realize your audience, largely thinks I'm a nut job. That's okay. uh, but if they do talk to religious people, this may help them at least understand that there are different types of folks out there. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Most of you enjoyed the conversations and lots of pleasant feedback in the chat. So thanks again. Really appreciate it. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
hey, you too, Tom. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Talk to you later.